Picture this. A skinny kid with a worn-out backpack shuffles through the cafeteria doors at Lincoln High School, clutching a crumpled $5 bill in his pocket. The lunch line stretches ahead of him, filled with students who've never had to choose between eating and having money for the bus ride home. What these predators circling him don't realize is that the quiet new kid counting quarters has hands registered as weapons in 3 different youth boxing divisions. What they're about to discover is that Marcus Thompson didn't earn his reputation by backing down from bullies, and today's lunch period is about to become a masterclass in why you should never judge someone by their appearance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog hung thick over Riverside, California, as Marcus Thompson stepped off the city bus at Lincoln High School for the first time. His worn Nike sneakers hit the pavement with the same measured rhythm that had carried him through countless rounds in Detroit's Motor City Boxing Club. At 16, Marcus had learned to read people the way other kids read social media posts, and right now, every instinct told him this place was going to test him in ways that had nothing to do with academics. Lincoln High sprawled across 15 acres of manicured suburban perfection, its red brick buildings and pristine walkways a stark contrast to the chain link and concrete of his old school in Detroit. The student parking lot gleamed with late model cars that cost more than his family's annual rent, while designer backpacks and the latest smartphones created a visual symphony of privilege that made Marcus acutely aware of his thrift store jacket and generic brand everything. He'd moved here 3 weeks ago when his father finally landed the warehouse supervisor job that promised better opportunities and safer neighborhoods. The promise of a fresh start had seemed like a blessing after the plant closure that devastated their Detroit community. But standing here among students who'd never known financial struggle, Marcus wondered if they'd simply traded one set of challenges for another. The transition hadn't been easy. His mother, Rosa, worked double shifts at 2 different nursing homes just to cover their modest apartment rent, while his father pulled overtime whenever possible to establish himself in the new position. Money remained tight, which meant Marcus had exactly $5 for lunch each day, carefully budgeted from his mother's tip jar that she kept for family emergencies. What none of his new classmates could possibly know was that Marcus Thompson had spent the last 8 years transforming himself from a frightened 8-year-old into one of the most promising young boxers in Michigan. Coach Williams at Motor City Boxing had seen something special in the scrawny kid who'd wandered into the gym after getting jumped by neighborhood bullies, and over the years had molded Marcus into a 3-time Golden Gloves regional champion. The training had been relentless. 6 days a week of conditioning, technique work and sparring that pushed Marcus beyond what he thought possible. Coach Williams had drummed into him that boxing wasn't about aggression or dominance, but about discipline, protection, and the kind of inner strength that came from knowing you could handle yourself in any situation. The medals gathering dust in their new apartment told only part of the story. The real victories were the bullies he'd faced down without throwing a punch, the confidence he'd gained from knowing his capabilities, and the respect he'd earned from opponents twice his size. But that was Detroit, and this was Riverside, where Marcus had decided to keep his boxing background quiet. He wanted to fit in, to be just another student focused on grades and graduation. The last thing he needed was the attention that came with being known as the fighter, especially when he'd learned that reputation often attracted the wrong kind of challenges. The first bell rang across campus, sending students streaming toward their respective buildings. Marcus checked his schedule one more time, navigating toward the math wing while trying to blend into the crowd. He'd always been good at observing, without being noticed, a skill that served him well both in the ring and in new social situations. His first 3 periods passed without incident. The teachers were friendly enough, the coursework manageable, and most students seemed too absorbed in their own social circles to pay much attention to the new kid. It wasn't until fourth period lunch that Marcus encountered the ecosystem that would change everything. The cafeteria buzzed with the familiar energy of teenage social hierarchies. Marcus grabbed a tray and joined the lunch line, mentally calculating whether he could afford both the sandwich and the fruit cup, or if he'd need to choose. Behind him, conversations flowed about weekend parties, college applications, and social drama that felt as foreign to him as a different language. That's when he first noticed them. 3 upperclassmen had positioned themselves strategically near the condiment station, close enough to the lunch line to observe but far enough from the faculty table to avoid scrutiny. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The leader was tall and athletic, wearing a Letterman jacket that marked him as part of the school's wrestling elite. His sandy hair was perfectly styled, and his confident posture suggested someone accustomed to getting his way. The second member of their group was built like a linebacker, with broad shoulders and the kind of intimidating presence that could clear a hallway without a word. He stood slightly behind the leader, scanning the cafeteria with predatory awareness that Marcus recognized from his boxing days. This was someone who enjoyed physical confrontation. The third completed their triangle, smaller than the others, but with sharp, calculating eyes that missed nothing. He held a smartphone and seemed to be taking notes, methodically documenting something about the students passing by their position. Marcus had seen groups like this before. The dynamics were unmistakable: a charismatic leader, reliable muscle, and a strategic brain working in coordination. What concerned him was how other students gave them a wide berth, the way conversations died when they approached, and the subtle fear that rippled through the cafeteria whenever they moved. As Marcus reached the cashier, he handed over his carefully counted bills and received his change with the precision of someone who couldn't afford mistakes. The lunch lady smiled warmly, unaware that this simple transaction represented careful family budgeting and sacrifice. Marcus tucked his remaining money into his pocket and looked around for an empty table where he could eat in peace and maybe start on his homework. The cafeteria's social geography became clearer as he navigated between tables. Athletes dominated. The center, honor students clustered near the windows, and various smaller groups claimed their territories with the same precision as rival boxing gyms dividing training schedules. Marcus spotted an empty table near the back wall, perfect for someone who preferred to observe rather than participate in the social theater surrounding him. But as he walked toward his chosen spot, he noticed something that made his stomach tighten with familiar dread. At a table near the back corner sat a freshman who couldn't have been more than 14, small for his age and clutching a worn sketchbook like a shield. The kid's lunch tray held only an apple and a small bag of chips, the kind of minimal meal that Marcus recognized as the result of careful rationing rather than choice. What made Marcus pause wasn't the boy's obvious vulnerability, but the way the 3 upperclassmen he'd noticed earlier were now moving with deliberate purpose toward the freshman's table. The leader approached with the casual confidence of someone who owned the space around him. Ethan Rodriguez had perfected the art of intimidation through years of practice, and his wrestling team captain status gave him just enough authority to operate in the gray areas where teachers couldn't quite prove wrongdoing. His approach was calculated, friendly on the surface, but carrying an undercurrent that made weaker students instinctively retreat. Marcus watched as Ethan slid into the seat across from the freshman, his smile never reaching his eyes. The kid looked up from his sketchbook with the startled expression of a deer caught in headlights, immediately recognizing the threat but having no idea how to respond. Trevor Mitchell positioned himself behind the freshman's chair, his massive frame blocking any potential escape route, while Nathan Cole took the seat to the boy's left, effectively trapping him in a triangle of intimidation. The freshman's name was Jamie Chen, though Marcus wouldn't learn this until later. Jamie had earned a partial scholarship to Lincoln High based on his exceptional artistic abilities, but his family's financial situation meant every dollar mattered. The scholarship covered tuition, but lunch money, supplies, and other daily expenses came out of his parents' restaurant wages, carefully budgeted and desperately needed. Ethan's voice carried just far enough for Marcus to catch fragments of the conversation. "Nice artwork you got there, Jamie. Real talent. Be a shame if something happened to mess it up, you know?" The threat was wrapped in conversational tone, but the message was crystal clear. Trevor leaned forward slightly, his shadow falling across Jamie's sketchbook, like a physical manifestation of the pressure being applied. Marcus had seen this exact scenario play out in Detroit, though usually in alleys or empty lots rather than school cafeterias. The methodology was identical: isolation, intimidation, and the gradual application of pressure until the victim felt they had no choice but to comply. What made this version particularly insidious was how it operated in plain sight, disguised as casual conversation that teachers would dismiss as normal student interaction. Nathan pulled out his phone, ostensibly checking messages, but actually documenting Jamie's reaction and calculating the optimal approach. He'd studied their target for weeks, noting Jamie's patterns, his isolation from social groups, and most importantly, his obvious financial limitations. Scholarship kids made perfect victims because they couldn't afford to lose money and rarely had the social connections necessary to seek help effectively. "Here's the thing, Jamie," Ethan continued, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. "This school can be tough for new kids, especially ones who stand out. Lucky for you, we provide a service. Think of it as insurance. $5 a day and we make sure nobody bothers you, your art supplies don't go missing, and your locker stays intact. Fair deal, right?" Jamie's hands trembled slightly as he gripped his pencil. $5 represented half his daily lunch. Budget, money his parents had specifically allocated for nutrition during long school days. Giving it up would mean surviving on whatever free samples the cafeteria occasionally offered, or simply going hungry until dinner. But the alternative, as Ethan was making clear, might be even worse. Marcus felt his jaw tighten as he watched the scene unfold. The methodical nature of the extortion triggered memories of his early days in Detroit, before Coach Williams had taught him that strength came from protecting others rather than protecting yourself. He'd been in Jamie's position once, trapped by circumstances and overwhelmed by predators who viewed vulnerability as opportunity. The wrestling captain's next words confirmed Marcus's worst suspicions about the scope of this operation. "Don't think you're special, kid. Everyone here pays. That's how things work at Lincoln. Your $5 joins a community fund that keeps everyone safe and happy. Smart students understand this system and don't cause problems." Trevor's contribution was purely physical, shifting his weight to remind Jamie of the size difference between them. At 17 and 190 pounds of muscle built through football training, Trevor represented the kind of physical threat that could turn psychological pressure into genuine fear. His role was simple but effective. Be present, be large, and let imagination fill in the details of what might happen if cooperation wasn't forthcoming. Nathan handled the logistics with business-like efficiency. "We're not unreasonable people," he said, sliding a small piece of paper toward Jamie. "We know money can be tight. You can pay daily, weekly, or monthly. There's even a payment plan if you need it. See, we're flexible, understanding. We want this to work for everyone." The paper contained Venmo and Cash App information, along with specific instructions for payment timing and consequences for late submissions. The entire operation had been digitized and systematized, turning bullying into a comprehensive business model that generated steady revenue while minimizing exposure to administrative intervention. Marcus realized this wasn't random harassment, but a sophisticated extortion ring that had likely been operating for months or even years. The casual nature of their approach suggested experience, while Nathan's documentation indicated they'd refined their methods through trial and error. This was predatory behavior elevated to an art form, targeting the most vulnerable students with scientific precision. Jamie's artistic talents made him particularly valuable as both victim and example. His visible creativity marked him as different, in a school culture that rewarded conformity, while his scholarship status signaled financial vulnerability. If they could break someone with Jamie's obvious gifts and determination, it would send a clear message to other potential resistors about the futility of standing up to their system. The freshman looked around desperately, hoping for intervention from teachers or fellow students. But the faculty table was positioned too far away to overhear the conversation, and other students had learned through experience to avoid eye contact when Ethan's crew was working. The isolation was complete and deliberate, designed to convince victims that resistance was both futile and dangerous. Ethan sensed Jamie's growing panic and moved to close the deal. "Look, I get it. New school, new rules. But this is how things work here. Pay the $5 and you're protected. Don't pay and well..." He gestured vaguely around the cafeteria. "Accidents happen. Lunch trays get knocked over. Backpacks disappear. Art projects get destroyed. You understand what I'm saying?" The threat was clear but deniable, phrased as concern rather than intimidation. If Jamie complained to teachers, Ethan could claim he'd been offering friendly advice about school dynamics. If incidents occurred later, they would appear random rather than retaliatory. The system had been designed to operate below the radar of adult intervention while maintaining maximum pressure on student victims. Marcus watched Jamie's shoulders slump in defeat as the reality of his situation became clear. The freshman was reaching for his wallet, preparing to hand over money his family couldn't afford to lose, when something inside Marcus snapped. Coach Williams had taught him that boxing skills came with responsibility, and that true champions protected those who couldn't protect themselves. Setting down his lunch tray with deliberate calm, Marcus began walking toward the table where 3 predators were about to claim another victim. Marcus approached with the same measured pace he'd used entering boxing rings across Michigan. His breathing controlled and his awareness heightened. Years of training had taught him to read situations before acting, and every detail of this encounter was burning itself into his memory. The way Ethan's shoulders tensed as he sensed someone approaching, how Trevor's head turned slightly to track the movement without fully acknowledging it. Nathan's fingers pausing over his phone screen as his peripheral vision caught the disruption to their routine. The cafeteria continued its normal rhythm around them, hundreds of students absorbed in their own conversations and completely unaware that a confrontation was building at the back corner table. Marcus had learned long ago that most people lived in bubbles of comfortable ignorance, only noticing conflict when it directly affected them. This learned blindness was what allowed predators like Ethan's crew to operate with such impunity. "Excuse me," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying just enough authority to cut through their conversation without creating a scene. "Mind if I sit down?" The request was polite, but not really a question. Marcus was already pulling out the empty chair next to Jamie, his movement smooth and confident in a way that suggested he wasn't asking permission so much as announcing his intention. The freshman looked up with surprise and confusion, while the 3 upperclassmen exchanged glances that communicated volumes about their irritation with this unexpected interruption. Ethan recovered first, his politician's smile sliding back into place as he assessed this new variable in their equation. "Sorry, we're having a private conversation here. Maybe find another table." The suggestion carried enough menace to intimidate most students, but Marcus had faced down opponents who could end fights with single punches, and high school social pressure felt manageable by comparison. "I'm Marcus," he said, directing his attention to Jamie while completely ignoring Ethan's dismissal. "New student, couldn't help but notice you've got some amazing artwork there." He gestured to the sketchbook that Jamie was still clutching like a lifeline. "Mind if I take a look?" The question served multiple purposes. It shifted attention away from the extortion attempt, gave Jamie a chance to breathe, and forced the three bullies to either escalate the confrontation or back down from their current approach. Marcus had learned this technique from watching Coach Williams defuse potential fights at the gym, using conversation and genuine interest to redirect aggressive energy. Jamie's face brightened slightly as he realized someone was actually interested in his art rather than using it as leverage for intimidation. "These are just sketches," he said modestly, but his grip on the book relaxed enough to flip it open to a page filled with detailed character designs. "I'm working on a graphic novel about kids who discover they have hidden powers." The irony wasn't lost on Marcus, who was sitting at a table with someone who genuinely had hidden powers while surrounded by bullies who were about to discover that fact the hard way. "That's incredible detail," he said, genuinely impressed by Jamie's skill level. "How long have you been drawing?" Trevor shifted impatiently behind Jamie's chair, clearly frustrated that their carefully orchestrated intimidation was being derailed by art appreciation. "Hey, new kid," he said, his voice carrying the kind of barely controlled aggression that had worked on smaller students for years. "We were here first. Find somewhere else to be friendly." Marcus looked up at Trevor with the same calm expression he'd perfected during pre-fight stare-downs, meeting the bigger boy's eyes without flinching or backing down. "I'm just talking to Jamie about his art," he replied evenly. "That's not against the rules, is it?" The challenge was subtle but unmistakable. Marcus was testing their commitment to the confrontation while giving them an opportunity to retreat without losing face completely. In boxing, this was called feeling out your opponent, learning their patterns and reactions before committing to any serious engagement. Trevor's response would tell Marcus everything he needed to know about how far they were willing to escalate. Nathan sensed the shifting dynamics and tried to regain control through his preferred method of psychological manipulation. "Look, Marcus, right? You seem like a smart guy. Lincoln High has its own social structure, and there are rules that keep everyone happy and safe. Maybe somebody should explain them to you before you accidentally get involved in something you don't understand." The threat was delivered with the kind of reasonable tone that made it sound like helpful advice, but Marcus recognized the technique from his Detroit days. Nathan was trying to isolate him from Jamie while simultaneously warning him about consequences for continued interference. It was a sophisticated approach that probably worked on most students who lacked experience with real conflict. Ethan decided to reassert his authority through direct confrontation. "What Nathan's trying to tell you is that we provide security services for students who need protection. Jamie here was just about to contribute to our community safety fund. $5 a day keeps problems away, if you know what I mean." The casual admission of extortion told Marcus everything he needed to know about their confidence level. They'd been operating with such success for so long that they didn't even bother hiding their activities from witnesses anymore. The system had become so normalized that they expected new students to either join the victim pool or simply look the other way. Marcus leaned back in his chair, maintaining his relaxed posture while keeping his hands visible and ready. "Community safety fund," he repeated thoughtfully. "That's an interesting way to describe theft." The word hung in the air like a physical presence, cutting through their euphemisms and calling their operation exactly what it was. Jamie's eyes widened as someone finally named what was happening to him, while the three upperclassmen felt their carefully constructed facade being stripped away by someone who refused to play their semantic games. Trevor stepped closer to Marcus's chair, using his size advantage to create physical pressure. "I think you should choose your words more carefully. New kid, sometimes people who say the wrong things have accidents. Serious accidents that affect their ability to enjoy their time at Lincoln High." The threat was no longer subtle, and Marcus could feel the familiar pre-fight energy beginning to build in his muscles. Coach Williams had always taught him that the moments before physical confrontation were the most important, when decisions made in seconds could determine outcomes that lasted much longer. Every instinct told him that these three had never faced real resistance, and their confidence came from a long history of unopposed success. "Jamie," Marcus said quietly, never taking his eyes off Trevor, "how much money do your parents give you for lunch each day?" The question confused everyone at the table, including Jamie himself. $10, he answered hesitantly, "but I try to save half for emergencies." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "So if someone takes $5 from you every day, you're living on half rations, probably going hungry most afternoons, and if you can't pay, they'll destroy your art supplies or damage your projects, which costs your family even more money they don't have." Each statement was delivered as fact rather than accusation, but the effect was to lay out the full scope of what Ethan's crew was doing to students like Jamie. The freshman was nodding along, finally understanding that his situation wasn't normal or acceptable, while the three bullies were realizing that their new opponent understood their system better than most adults. Ethan decided to end the conversation before it could spiral further out of their control. "Time's up, new kid. You've had your chance to walk away. Now, we do this the hard way." He stood up from the table, his wrestling team jacket catching the cafeteria lighting in a way that emphasized his physical conditioning and competitive background. Trevor moved to flank Marcus's other side, while Nathan began filming with his phone, either to document the confrontation or to have evidence for later retaliation, depending on how things developed. Marcus remained seated, his breathing steady, and his posture relaxed, despite being surrounded by three larger opponents in what was clearly a planned intimidation display. "Jamie," he said calmly, "you should probably move back a little bit." The freshman scrambled away from the table, clutching his sketchbook and lunch tray, while other nearby students began to notice that something significant was developing in the back corner of the cafeteria. Marcus stood up slowly, his movements controlled and purposeful, as he prepared to demonstrate why you should never judge someone's capabilities based on their appearance or their willingness to avoid conflict when possible. The transformation in Marcus's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. His shoulders squared without becoming tense, his weight shifted to the balls of his feet without appearing aggressive, and his hands found that perfect balance between relaxed and ready that separated trained fighters from street brawlers. Years of conditioning under Coach Williams had ingrained these responses so deeply that they activated automatically when genuine threats emerged. Coach Williams had been more than just a boxing instructor at Motor City Boxing Club. He'd been a former Golden Gloves champion himself, a man who'd learned hard lessons about when to fight and when to walk away during his own journey through Detroit's unforgiving streets. The old coach had taken one look at 8-year-old Marcus, bruised and angry after another encounter with neighborhood bullies, and seen potential that went far beyond athletic ability. "Boxing isn't about hurting people, son," Coach Williams had said during their first training session, his gravelly voice carrying the authority of someone who'd survived everything the sport could throw at him. It's about confidence. It's about knowing you can protect yourself and others when words aren't enough. But most importantly, it's about having the discipline to only use these skills when absolutely necessary. Those lessons had been reinforced through 8 years of training that pushed Marcus beyond what he'd thought possible. 6 days a week of conditioning that built both physical strength and mental resilience. Technique work that taught him to read opponents like books, anticipating their movements before they'd fully committed to action. Sparring sessions against fighters who outweighed him by 30 or 40 pounds, teaching him that size advantages could be neutralized through superior skill and ring intelligence. The 3 Golden Gloves championships Marcus had earned weren't just trophies gathering dust in his bedroom. They represented hundreds of hours of preparation, dozens of opponents who'd underestimated his abilities based on his size, and countless moments when he'd had to overcome fear and doubt through pure determination. More importantly, they'd taught him that real strength came from protecting others rather than proving dominance. But none of his Lincoln High classmates knew any of this. To them, Marcus was just the quiet new kid who kept to himself and seemed more interested in homework than social hierarchies. Even Ethan's crew had initially dismissed him as another potential victim, rather than recognizing the controlled power that moved with deliberate purpose rather than teenage swagger. The cafeteria's background noise seemed to fade as Marcus assessed the tactical situation developing around their table. Ethan stood directly across from him, his wrestling background evident in the way he maintained balance and kept his center of gravity low. Trevor had positioned himself to Marcus's left, relying on size and football conditioning to create intimidation through physical presence. Nathan remained seated, but had his phone ready, either to document their victory or call for help if things went differently than expected. Marcus had faced similar odds before, though never in a school cafeteria surrounded by witnesses who might complicate the aftermath. The key was maintaining control of the situation while using minimal force, ending the confrontation quickly before teachers intervened or other students got involved. Coach Williams had always emphasized that the best fights were the ones you won without throwing punches. But sometimes circumstances forced your hand. "Last chance, new kid," Ethan said, his voice carrying the kind of confidence that came from years of unopposed success. "Walk away now, and we'll pretend this conversation never happened. Keep interfering with our business, and things get complicated for you." The ultimatum was delivered with practiced authority, designed to give Marcus one final opportunity to back down before they escalated to physical confrontation. Ethan had used this exact approach dozens of times, and it usually worked because most students understood the social and physical consequences of challenging the established power structure. Marcus tilted his head slightly, studying Ethan with the same analytical approach he'd used before championship fights. The wrestling captain was strong and technically skilled, but his movements carried the kind of telegraphed aggression that came from relying on intimidation rather than actual combat experience. Trevor was larger but slower, the kind of opponent who depended on overwhelming force rather than technique. Nathan was smart but physically untested, more dangerous as a strategist than as a direct threat. "Here's a better idea," Marcus replied, calmly. "You 3 walk away from Jamie, find a new hobby that doesn't involve stealing lunch money from kids who can't afford to lose it, and we all pretend this conversation never happened." The counter-proposal was delivered in the same reasonable tone Ethan had used, but it completely reversed the power dynamic they'd spent years establishing. Marcus wasn't asking for permission or negotiating from a position of weakness. He was offering them a face-saving exit from a situation that was about to spiral beyond their control. Ethan's face flushed with anger and embarrassment as he realized this nobody transfer student was treating him like an equal rather than showing the deference he'd come to expect. "You have no idea who you're messing with," he said, stepping closer to invade Marcus's personal space. "I'm captain of the wrestling team. Trevor starts at linebacker. We run this school, and you're about to learn what happens to people who don't respect that." The boast revealed everything Marcus needed to know about their mindset and experience level. They'd never faced real opposition, never encountered someone who couldn't be intimidated by reputation and social status. Their confidence came from a closed system where they'd always been the biggest fish. But they were about to discover what happened when that system encountered someone who'd been tested in much deeper waters. Marcus remained perfectly still as Ethan invaded his space, neither backing down nor escalating the physical confrontation. "I respect ability," he said quietly. "I respect people who use their strength to protect others instead of preying on them. What I don't respect is cowards who gang up on kids half their size to steal their lunch money." The insult cut deeper than any physical blow could have, striking directly at the self-image they'd constructed around their dominance of Lincoln High's social hierarchy. Ethan's hands clenched into fists as his carefully maintained composure finally cracked under the pressure of being challenged by someone who refused to acknowledge his authority. Trevor decided the talking portion of their encounter was over. "That's enough," he growled, moving to grab Marcus's shoulder in the kind of intimidating grip that had ended countless previous confrontations before they could develop into actual fights. His approach was straightforward and predictable, the kind of move that worked on students who lacked experience with physical conflict. Marcus had been waiting for exactly this moment. The second Trevor's hand made contact with his shoulder, everything Coach Williams had taught him about timing and leverage came into play. He stepped slightly to his right while pivoting on his back foot, using Trevor's forward momentum against him in a move that looked effortless but required years of practice to execute properly. Trevor found himself grasping air as Marcus slipped. The grab, his own forward motion, carrying him past his intended target and into an awkward stumble that left him off balance and confused. The technique was so subtle that most observers would assume Trevor had simply missed his grab, rather than recognizing that Marcus had demonstrated superior positioning and timing. Ethan launched himself forward while Trevor was still recovering, his wrestling instincts taking over as he attempted to use his superior size and technique to overwhelm Marcus through direct confrontation. His approach was technically sound and properly executed, the kind of takedown that had won him countless matches against high school opponents who lacked the experience to counter his favorite techniques. But Marcus wasn't a high school wrestler. With limited combat experience, he was a three-time Golden Gloves champion who'd learned to read opponents' intentions before they'd fully committed to their attacks. As Ethan closed the distance, Marcus shifted his weight and used a basic boxing defensive technique to redirect the wrestling captain's momentum while maintaining his own balance and position. The result was spectacular and completely unexpected. Ethan found himself flying past Marcus and crashing into the cafeteria table with enough force to send lunch trays and chairs scattering in every direction. The impact was loud enough to draw attention from across the cafeteria, and suddenly their private confrontation became a very public spectacle. Nathan jumped to his feet as he realized their carefully planned intimidation was falling apart in a front of multiple witnesses with recording capabilities. The strategic advantage they'd maintained through reputation and fear was evaporating as students pulled out phones to document whatever was happening at the back corner table. The cafeteria erupted into chaos as word spread that someone was actually standing up to Ethan's crew. Students who'd been victims of their extortion scheme felt a surge of hope they hadn't experienced in months, while others simply pulled out their phones to capture what promised to be the most dramatic confrontation Lincoln High had seen in years. The background chatter transformed into excited whispers as everyone tried to understand how the quiet new kid had just sent the wrestling captain flying across a table. Trevor recovered from his failed grab attempt and charged forward with the kind of blind aggression that had intimidated countless opponents on football fields. His approach was purely physical, relying on size and momentum to overwhelm Marcus through brute force rather than technique. But Marcus had spent years sparring against heavyweights who could end fights with single punches, and Trevor's predictable assault felt manageable by comparison. As Trevor closed the distance, Marcus demonstrated why defensive boxing was considered an art form. He slipped the linebacker's wild swing with minimal movement, redirecting Trevor's momentum while stepping aside at precisely the right moment. Trevor's own force carried him past Marcus and directly into Nathan, sending both of them tumbling to the floor in a tangle of limbs and confusion. Ethan pulled himself up from the wreckage of overturned chairs and scattered lunch trays, his face burning with embarrassment and rage. The wrestling captain had built his reputation on physical dominance, and being humiliated in front of the entire cafeteria represented a threat to everything he'd constructed at Lincoln High. "You think you're tough?" he snarled, circling Marcus, like a predator looking for an opening. "I'm going to destroy you." Marcus remained perfectly calm, his breathing controlled and his stance balanced as he watched Ethan search for an advantage. "I think this has gone far enough," he said quietly. "Jamie keeps his lunch money, you find a different way to spend your time, and everyone goes back to eating their food." The reasonable suggestion only further enraged Ethan, who couldn't comprehend how someone was treating him like an equal rather than showing the fear and respect he'd come to expect. He launched another attack, this time using proper wrestling technique, combined with the kind of desperate aggression that came from fighting for social survival. But Marcus had learned long ago that desperation made opponents predictable rather than dangerous. He used a classic boxing counter, timing his movement perfectly to avoid Ethan's takedown attempt while positioning himself for a response that would end the confrontation definitively. The combination was textbook perfect, demonstrating years of training condensed into a few seconds of controlled violence. Ethan found himself on the floor again, this time with a bloody nose and the dawning realization that he'd encountered someone far beyond his ability to intimidate or defeat. Trevor and Nathan struggled to untangle themselves from their collision, both sporting bruises and the kind of confusion that came from having their worldview completely overturned in less than 2 minutes. The cafeteria fell silent as students processed what they'd just witnessed. 3 upperclassmen who terrorized Lincoln High for years had been systematically dismantled by someone who looked like he should have been their next victim. Phones captured every moment, ensuring that word of this confrontation would spread far beyond the immediate witnesses. Principal Davis arrived with security guards just as Marcus was helping Jamie collect his scattered artwork from the floor. The administrator's face showed the kind of resignation that came from dealing with too many incidents involving the same students, though his expression shifted to confusion when he realized the usual suspects were the ones who appeared to have been defeated. "What happened here?" Principal Davis demanded, surveying the overturned tables and injured students with practiced efficiency. Before anyone else could speak, Jamie stepped forward with newfound confidence. "They were trying to steal my lunch money," he said clearly. Marcus stopped them. The simple statement cut through any potential confusion about who was responsible. For what? Other students began speaking up, sharing their own experiences with Ethan's extortion scheme and expressing gratitude that someone had finally stood up to the bullies who'd made their lives miserable. Principal Davis looked at Marcus with new interest, recognizing that this quiet transfer student had somehow accomplished what the administration had failed to achieve, despite multiple complaints and investigations. "And you are?" "Marcus Thompson," he replied respectfully. "I just transferred here from Detroit. I was trying to eat lunch when I saw these three demanding money from Jamie. The explanation was simple and truthful, focusing on the immediate incident rather than the broader implications of what had occurred. Marcus understood that adults preferred clear narratives over complicated discussions about systemic bullying and student power dynamics. As paramedics arrived to treat Ethan's bloody nose and check Trevor for potential concussion symptoms, Nathan found himself facing questions about the videos on his phone that documented their extortion activities. The evidence was overwhelming, and their long reign of terror at Lincoln High was finally coming to an end. Jamie clutched his sketchbook with hands that no longer trembled, surrounded by classmates who were seeing him as a person rather than a target for the first time in months. "Thank you," he whispered to Marcus. "I didn't think anyone would ever help." Marcus smiled, remembering Coach Williams's words about using strength to protect others. "Everyone deserves to feel safe at school," he said. "Your art is amazing, and no one should be able to take that away from you." The aftermath brought swift changes to Lincoln High. Ethan, Trevor, and Nathan faced suspension and criminal charges. For their extortion scheme, the administration implemented new anti-bullying policies and created support systems for victims who'd been too afraid to speak up previously. Marcus became something of a legend, though he preferred to focus on his studies and the boxing club. He started to teach other students basic self-defense techniques. Jamie blossomed into a confident young artist, whose graphic novel about kids with hidden powers became the most popular story in the school literary magazine. The lunch money extortion ring was permanently dismantled, replaced by a culture where students looked out for each other rather than preying on the vulnerable. And Marcus learned that sometimes the best way to start fresh in a new place was simply to be the person you'd always been trained to be. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.